He didn't hire her to save his family. He hired her to cook and clean and stay out of his way. But the morning Eliza Rowan walked through the front door of the Crow Ranch with a cracked leather satchel and mud on her boots, something shifted. Something even Thaddeus couldn't name and wouldn't admit for a very long time. Two boys who had stopped believing in people. A man who had stopped believing in himself. And a house so cold it had forgotten what warmth felt like. This is the story of how one woman changed all of that, without ever asking for a single thing in return. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. The town of Black Hollow had a way of making people feel small. It wasn't the mountains, though the Beartooth Range rose in the west like something that had never once considered human beings worth noticing. It wasn't the wind either, though that wind came off the high plains in October with a kind of personal hostility, cutting through wool coats and cracked door frames like it had a grievance to settle. It was something else, something harder to name. Black Hollow made people feel small because it didn't care whether they stayed or left. The land didn't soften for grief. The sky didn't pause for hardship. Winter came on the exact same schedule regardless of how badly a family was struggling, and spring arrived without apology for everything it had allowed to die. The frontier had no sentiment, and after enough years inside it, neither did the people who tried to call it home. Thaddeus Crow had lived in Black Hollow for 19 years. He'd arrived as a young man with broad shoulders, a stubborn streak, and a wife named Margaret, who laughed at things that weren't quite funny yet, but would be, eventually, if you waited long enough. He'd built the ranch with his own hands, not in the romantic sense that people told stories about later, but in the literal, bleeding, cursing 3 failed attempts before one. That held sense. He'd lost fingernails to cold iron. He'd argued with the earth. He'd won enough times to keep going and lost enough times to understand that winning wasn't permanent. Margaret died 4 years ago. Fever took her in March, fast and without warning, the way the worst things always seem to happen on this land. Not building towards something terrible, but arriving at it sideways, when your back was turned. After that, the ranch kept running. Thaddeus made sure of it. He got up before dawn, worked until dark, fell into bed, and started again. He fed his boys. He maintained the fences. He negotiated with the cattlemen who came through every fall to buy his stock. He did everything that needed doing. He just did it inside a house that had gone very, very quiet. He'd tried housekeepers before. 3 of them, over 4 years. The first was a widow named Mrs. Caulfield from the east side of town. She lasted 6 weeks before deciding the Crow household was, in her words, beyond reasonable management. She left on a Tuesday without finishing the laundry. The second was a younger woman, barely 20, who'd come from a mining family that had gone broke. She stayed 3 months, did adequate work, and then married a farmhand from a neighboring property. Thaddeus didn't blame her for that. He blamed her for leaving without 2 weeks' notice. The third didn't make it past the first week. She took one look at the boys, specifically at Nolan, who had perfected a particular expression of flat, hostile indifference that could strip the warmth from a room the way a cold draft strips heat from a fire, and announced that she wasn't suited to rural life after all. After that, Thaddeus stopped trying for a while. He and the boys managed on their own, which mostly meant burned beans 3 nights a week, and laundry done badly on Sundays, and a general atmosphere of competent despair. It wasn't tragic. It was just bleak in the way that becomes invisible when it goes on long enough. It was his neighbor, Hal Briggs, who finally convinced him to try again. "You look like something the horses dragged in," Hal said, leaning against the fence post one September afternoon. Hal was 62 and had the kind of face that had been weathered into pure honesty. He said what he thought because life was too short and winter too long for anything else. "I'm fine," Thaddeus said. "Your fine looks like most people's rock bottom." Hal pushed his hat up. "There's a woman in town, asking around for domestic work. Dorothy Marsh knows her, says she's capable. Quiet. Not the type to bolt at the first hard day." Thaddeus grunted. He'd heard that before. "Her name's Eliza Rowan," Hal continued. "Lost her position over in Millbrook when the family she worked for moved back east. She's got no family in the territory. She needs the work, and she needs it to last." He paused. "Meaning she won't leave over nothing. She's got nowhere else to go." Thaddeus looked out over his land, the sagging barn roof he hadn't fixed yet, The kitchen garden that had gone wild after Margaret died. The general evidence of a man doing two people's work and falling short of both. "Send her by," he said. "I'll talk to her." Eliza Rowan arrived on a Thursday morning in early October, and the first thing Thaddeus noticed was that she didn't wait to be helped down from the wagon. The driver, old Pete Garner, who ran a freight route through the valley, had barely pulled the horses to a stop before she was already climbing down herself, one hand gripping the side rail, the other holding her satchel clear of the wheel. She landed in the mud of the yard with a practical thud and looked around the property the way a person looks at a problem they're already calculating how to solve. She was maybe 30, though it was hard to tell precisely. She had dark hair pinned up under a plain hat, a coat that had been mended in at least 2 places, and the kind of face that wasn't beautiful in the way paintings were beautiful, but was the kind of face you kept looking at because something in it was always slightly different than you'd noticed before. Her jaw was set, her eyes were brown and direct, and carried the specific quality of someone who had learned not to expect much, but hadn't yet decided to stop hoping entirely. She saw Thaddeus standing on the porch and walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Crow," she said. Not a question. "Miss Rowan." He stepped down. They shook hands. Hers was cold from the ride and grip was firm. "Dorothy Marsh said you needed someone reliable," she said. "I'm reliable." "Dorothy says a lot of things." "Then I suppose you'll have to judge for yourself." She glanced past him at the house. "May I see the kitchen first?" Thaddeus almost said no out of pure reflex. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Help yourself." She went in without fuss. He followed. The kitchen was a disaster, and he knew it. The stove needed blacking. The shelves were disorganized in a way that made it unclear whether there was a system or just accumulated chaos. The window over the sink had a cracked pane that had been covered with oiled paper for, he realized with some shame, almost 8 months. There were pots that had been scrubbed hard but not quite clean enough, and a smell of old grease that he'd gone nose-blind to sometime in the spring. Eliza walked through it without comment. She opened cabinet doors, checked the larder, looked at the water situation, tested the stove's damper with a practiced hand. She didn't wrinkle her nose. She didn't say anything theatrical about the state of the place. She just gathered information, the way a general assesses a battlefield before committing to a strategy. Finally, she turned around. "You've been doing this yourselves," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Me and the boys." "How old?" "Nolan is 12, Samuel is 8. She nodded. "I'll need to know your schedule when you eat, when the boys need to be ready for school if they're going, what you need from me on the working days versus the quiet ones." "There aren't many quiet ones." "Then we'll figure out the working ones." She set her satchel down on the table, not asking permission, just claiming a temporary corner of space. "I won't pretend I know your ranch. I'll need time to understand how things work here. But I don't waste time, and I don't make excuses, and I don't leave over hard weather or a difficult day." Thaddeus looked at her. "The last 3 left." "I'm not them." "No," he said slowly. "I can see that." He folded his arms. 2-month trial. Meals, housing in the back room, $5 a month. If it works out, we discuss terms going forward. If it doesn't, then we part without argument, she finished. "That's fair." He hadn't expected her to say that so quickly. Most people negotiated, pushed for more money, better terms, some kind of guarantee. She just accepted the deal with the confidence of someone who intended to make the argument for better terms unnecessary. "One thing," he said. She waited. "The boys." He paused, choosing his words with the awkwardness of a man not accustomed to talking about things that actually mattered. "They've had a hard time, with their mother gone, and with people coming and going, Nolan especially. He's not easy." "I didn't come here expecting easy," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," he said quickly, and he wasn't sure whether he was saying that to her or to himself. "Just don't push them. Don't try to be something you're not. They'll see through it." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Crow, I'm not here to be anyone's mother. I'm here to do a job. Whatever else happens is up to the boys, not me." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. "All right." She met the boys that evening. Thaddeus brought them in from where they'd been doing afternoon chores, or in Nolan's case, doing them slowly and resentfully, which he'd elevated into something close to an art form. They came through the back door tracking Mud, Samuel chattering about a bird's nest he'd found in the hay, Nolan silent and already measuring the situation with eyes that were too old for his face. The kitchen smelled different. That was the first thing. Something was on the stove, a proper something, not beans and salt pork. And there was bread cooling on the counter, and the dishes that had been sitting in the rack crooked for weeks were somehow stacked correctly. Eliza was at the stove. She turned when they came in, and she didn't smile in that bright, forced way that strangers sometimes did when they were trying to win over children they were nervous about. She just looked at them the same way she'd looked at everything else in this house, directly, without pretending. "Samuel, Nolan," Thaddeus said. "This is Miss Rowan. She'll be staying with us." Samuel, being 8 and still operating on the basic assumption that adults were trustworthy until proven otherwise, looked at her with open curiosity. "You made bread?" "I did." "Can I have some?" "After supper." "What's for supper?" "Beef stew." He nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Okay." Nolan said nothing. He stood by the door with his coat still on, looking at her the way he'd looked at the last 3 housekeepers. Like he was already counting down to when she'd leave, not with malice exactly, more with the weary, preemptive certainty of someone who had been disappointed enough times to have made disappointment part of his permanent worldview. Eliza looked at him. She didn't try to draw him out, didn't comment on his silence or his expression, didn't say anything at all to him for a long moment. Then, "Coat hooks are by the door." That was it. Not an order, not a reprimand, just information. Nolan looked at the hooks. He hung up his coat. He went and sat at the table without another word. Thaddeus watched this from the doorway, something turning over slowly in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. Supper was good. Better than anything in this kitchen in 4 years. Nobody said that out loud, but everybody noticed. The first week was defined by logistics. Eliza was up before everyone else. Thaddeus discovered this accidentally on the second morning when he came downstairs at 5 in the dark, expecting silence, and found instead the stove already going, coffee already made, and Eliza at the table with a small notebook, writing something. She closed it when she heard him on the stairs, not guilty, just private. "Coffee's there," she said. He poured a cup. It was better coffee than he'd made in a year. "You sleep?" he asked. "Enough." He nodded. He didn't ask what she'd been writing. They were strangers. There were limits. She learned the ranch faster than he expected. The first few days she stuck to the house and transformed it in ways that were so systematic and quiet that he kept noticing things from across the room without quite being able to track what had changed. The windows were clean, the floor had been scrubbed and was now actually showing its grain again. The larder had been reorganized according to some logic that made it, for the first time in years, easy to find what you needed without moving 4 other things first. She didn't ask his permission for any of it. She didn't report back on what she'd done. She just did it. On the 4th day, she asked him, practically and without preamble, whether the boys had any schedule for schoolwork, since she'd noticed their textbooks on the shelf, and they appeared to have been untouched for some time. He'd been honest about that. "I've not been able to keep up with it. The days are too long." She didn't judge this. She just said, "If it helps, I can sit with them in the evenings. I'm no school teacher, but I know enough arithmetic and reading to keep them from falling behind completely." He looked at her. "That's not in the arrangement." "No," she agreed. "But it's something I can do." He wanted to say something about not overstepping, about keeping the arrangement professional, about not creating obligations on either side. Instead, he said, "All right, if they'll let you." They let her. Samuel immediately. Nolan, eventually. The problem with Nolan wasn't cruelty. He wasn't a mean boy. He was a hurt boy who had made the very reasonable 12-year-old decision that the safest thing to do with new people was to treat them as temporary, because they always were. His technique for discouraging attachment was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle and comprehensive. He answered in single words when she spoke to him. He performed his chores competently, but with a flatness that communicated very clearly that he was doing them because he had to, not because of any goodwill toward the household. He occasionally disappeared to the barn for hours, which Thaddeus told her was his habit, and to leave him to it. Eliza left him to it. She didn't try to win him. She didn't push conversation or manufacture moments. She just maintained her steady presence in the house and continued doing her work and treated him the same way she treated everything else on this ranch, as something real that deserved to be dealt with honestly. The first crack came at the end of the second week, and it came sideways, the way things always do with children who have built their defenses carefully. She was in the kitchen late on a Wednesday evening, still working through a pile of mending, shirts mostly, that had accumulated repairs the way unloved things do. Nolan had gone to bed an hour ago, or so she'd thought. She heard the creak of the stair, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway, barefoot, in his nightshirt, carrying a book. She looked up. He looked at her. "I can't sleep," he said, not asking for anything, just stating a fact. "There's warm milk in the pot," she said, "if you want it." He considered this for a moment. He came into the kitchen, poured himself some milk without being guided to where anything was. He knew this kitchen, of course, better than she did, and sat down at the far end of the table from where she was working. He opened his book. She went back to mending. They sat like that for maybe half an hour, not talking. Just two people in a kitchen at night, both finding it slightly easier to be awake in the company of another person than alone. When he got up to go back to bed, he paused at the door. "Mama used to mend things at night," he said. Very quiet. Looking at the floor, not at her. She kept her hand still on the shirt in her lap. "Did she?" "Yeah." A pause. "She said there was something better about doing it then, when it was quiet. She was right about that." He looked up briefly. Something crossed his face, too fast to name, too important to dismiss. Then he went upstairs. She sat in the kitchen for another few minutes after he was gone, listening to the house settle around her in the dark. Thaddeus watched all of this from the edges. He was not by nature an observant man in the domestic sense. He noticed things about land and weather and livestock with a precision that bordered on prophetic. He could look at a fence line and know which post was going to fail before winter. He could smell a storm 2 days out. He understood cattle in the way some men understood people. People were harder, but he noticed that Nolan had started doing his homework voluntarily in the evenings. He noticed that Samuel had taken to following Eliza around with the specific devotion of a small dog who has found his person, chattering at her constantly about every thought that entered his head, and that she received this information about birds, about a boy at school who had said something stupid, about whether horses dreamed, with complete seriousness. He noticed that the house no longer felt like a place where someone had died, which was the feeling it had carried for 4 years, like a smell you can't quite locate. He told himself this was the natural result of having the household properly managed. That was what he'd hired her for. He tried to believe that. By the end of the first month, the 2-month trial had already stopped feeling like a trial. Not because everything was easy. It wasn't. The ranch work in October was relentless. Getting the cattle moved before the first hard freeze, winterizing the structures, 100 tasks that had to be done before the cold made them impossible. Thaddeus was out before dawn every day, and back after dark most nights. And the boys helped where they could, and somewhere in all of it, Eliza was managing the house, the meals, the laundry, the mending, the boys' schoolwork in the evenings. She did it without complaint. She also, occasionally, did it wrong. She overestimated the firewood supply by a full cord, and he had to correct her estimate before she ordered too little. She made something with turnips one night that no one could quite identify, and no one enjoyed. She reorganized the tool shed according to a logic that made sense to her and 0 sense to Thaddeus, and they had a brief argument about it, the first direct conflict between them, that ended with her explaining her system and him acknowledging, grudgingly, that it had some merit, and her acknowledging, equally grudgingly, that she should have asked first. The argument cleared something between them. They'd been careful with each other, the way employer and employee are careful, maintaining the professional distance that protects both sides from complication. The argument was the first honest exchange they'd had, and after it the careful quality in the air shifted slightly. Not gone, just less rigid. One evening at the end of October, he came in later than usual, cold through to the bone, a cut across his left palm from a wire that had snapped back at him. He hadn't thought much of it. Cuts happened. She saw his hand when he came in and didn't say anything dramatic about it. She just said, "Sit down. I'll get the kit." "It's fine. It needs to be cleaned." He wanted to say again that it was fine, because he was used to managing his own injuries, had been doing it for years, and the idea of being fussed over sat wrong with him. But he sat down because it did need cleaning, and he was too tired to do it himself properly, and he put his hand out across the table while she worked on it. She was quick and efficient about it. Minimal fuss. But her hands were careful, and the lamp was close, and for a moment he was aware of the kitchen the way he hadn't been in a long time. The smell of whatever was in the pot, the sound of the boys upstairs, the particular quality of the light at that hour, and this woman's hands holding his hand steady. He looked at her, and she looked up at almost the same moment, and there was a second, 1 second, that was something else. Then she tied off this bandage and sat back. "Keep it clean," she said, same practical voice. "It'll be fine by the end of the week." "Thank you," he said. She nodded and went back to the stove. He sat at the table for a moment longer than necessary before getting up to wash. 3 days later, he extended her trial period without being asked. "The 2 months aren't up yet," he said one morning while she was making breakfast and he was pulling on his coat. "But I see no reason to wait. The arrangement's working. If you want to stay on permanently, the terms we discussed hold." She was at the stove, her back to him. A brief pause. "That works for me," she said. "Good." He pulled on his gloves. "I'll have something drawn up." "No need for papers," she said. "Your word's enough." He was at the door. He turned at that, slightly surprised. "You sure about that?" She looked over her shoulder at him. "Have you given me any reason not to trust your word, Mr. Crow?" He thought about it. "No." "Then we're agreed." He went out. She stood at the stove and didn't let herself feel too much about it. A permanent position wasn't security. Not really. Nothing was permanent in this territory. She knew that. But it was closer to solid ground than anything she'd had in a long time. And she'd learned to be grateful for solid ground without demanding that it be anything more. The first hard snow came in November. It arrived overnight without ceremony, the way Montana snow did. You went to bed under a clear sky and woke up to a world changed entirely. Thaddeus went out at first light and came back an hour later to report that 2 sections of fence on the north pasture were down and 3 head of cattle had wandered into the timber. "I'll need the full day," he told her. "Boys can help at the near pasture. The rest I'll do alone." "What about the horses?" she asked. The bay mare was favoring her front left yesterday. He stopped. He hadn't noticed that. He'd been moving too fast. "I'll check her before I go." "I already looked," she said. "Left front shoe is loose, stone caught up under it. I got it out, but you'll want the farrier before she goes back on hard ground." He looked at her. "When did you—" "Before breakfast." She handed him his coffee. "Also, the roof over the tack room is holding snow. You might want to knock it before it builds weight." He stood in his own kitchen feeling, for a disorienting moment, like someone was looking after his ranch. Not doing his job. He wasn't a man who easily tolerated anyone encroaching on what he considered his domain, but just paying attention to it. Noticing the things he didn't have time to notice because he was always moving at full speed toward the next crisis. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said, completely matter of fact. "Coffee's going to get cold." He drank his coffee. He went out into the snow. He spent a long time out there in the cold, moving through the work that needed doing, and he thought about her more than was strictly professional. He tried to be honest with himself about what that meant, and the answer he came back to was complicated and not something I'm going to address. Not now. Not with the fences down and the cattle loose and winter just starting to make its intentions clear. He was a practical man. He was very good at dealing with what was in front of him and postponing what wasn't. That approach had worked well for him for years. He was not yet aware that it was beginning to fail. December arrived the way December always does in Montana, without mercy. The temperature dropped to places that required a different relationship with the cold, an understanding that you were at its mercy, and the only question was how well you managed that. The boys were in school when weather permitted, which grew increasingly irregular. The ranch contracted into survival mode. Keep the animals alive, keep the people warm, keep the structures standing. Eliza had never lived through a Montana winter. She'd been in the territory less than 4 years, and the winters she'd experienced had been in towns, with real stores nearby and neighbors within shouting distance. The Crow Ranch was a different proposition. The nearest neighbor was the Briggs place, 3 miles of open field away. The nearest town was a 40-minute ride when the road was clear, which it increasingly wasn't. She adapted, not gracefully. There was nothing graceful about learning to bank a stove properly when the temperature outside could kill a person, about judging how much wood would carry the night, about the particular misery of outdoor work in cold that made your face hurt. She got it wrong sometimes. She underestimated the cold the first real brutal night and let the kitchen fire burn too low, and she woke at 3 in the morning to find the water in the bucket by the sink beginning to ice at the edges. She spent an hour getting the house back to livable temperature, moving quietly so as not to wake the others, and stood in the kitchen afterward with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd made as much for the warmth of holding it as for the drinking. She didn't tell anyone. She just made note of the lesson and adjusted. Samuel noticed things were different anyway. He was a perceptive child under the cheerful noise of his 8-year-old personality. And in December, he began appearing in the kitchen earlier than usual, nominally for breakfast, but actually, she suspected, because the kitchen was the warmest room and he liked to be where she was. "Miss Eliza," he said one morning, sitting at the table while she made oatmeal, "do you get scared here?" She considered the question seriously, the way she'd noticed he wanted to be considered. "Sometimes," she said. "Of what?" "The cold, some nights. The quiet, other nights." She stirred the pot. "Both of those can make you feel smaller than you want to feel." He thought about this. "I get scared of the dark," he said, with the solemn confession of someone admitting something important. "Nolan says that's for babies." "Nolan's afraid of things too," she said. "He just doesn't say what they are." Samuel's eyes went wide, as if this were a revelation. "Like what?" "That's his business to say, not mine." She set his oatmeal in front of him. "But people who tell you they're not afraid of anything are either lying or not paying attention." He looked at his oatmeal, then at her. "Are you afraid of my dad?" She laughed, a short, honest sound. "No, why would I be afraid of your father?" "He's real serious," Samuel said, with the accuracy of a child who doesn't yet know to soften observations. "He never laughs." She thought about whether that was true. It mostly was. "Sometimes people stop laughing for a while," she said. "It doesn't mean they forgot how." Samuel accepted this with the faith of a child who wants to believe something is true, which is almost the same thing as it being true. It was a week before Christmas when Thaddeus found her in the barn. He'd gone out to check on the animals after supper, and she was in there, in the cold and the lamplight, working on a harness that had cracked along one of the cheek pieces. Delicate leather work, the kind that required patience and a certain knack that wasn't obvious. She was hunched over it at the workbench, working by feel as much as sight in the low lamp, and she had a smear of neat's foot oil on her cheek that she was unaware of. "That harness," he said from the doorway. She looked up, unsurprised. "Found it yesterday. It'll fail midwinter if it's not fixed." "I was going to get to it." "I know." She went back to the work. "I got to it first." He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment. The horses were settled in their stalls, breathing their warm breath into the cold air. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light. Outside, the wind was doing what Montana wind did in December, which was try to convince you that the world was a hostile and indifferent place. "You don't have to do the barn work," he said. It came out less like a reprimand than he intended. "I know what my job is," she said. "I also know what needs doing." "There's a difference." She looked up at him then. Something in her expression that wasn't quite amusement, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Mr. Crow, are you concerned I'm doing too much work?" Put like that, it sounded absurd. "I'm concerned about the arrangement," he said, which was a cowardly version of what he actually meant. But the more honest version wasn't something he was ready to say in a cold barn at night while she looked at him with those direct brown eyes. She set the harness down and turned to face him properly. "The arrangement is fine," she said. "I know what I agreed to, and I know what I'm choosing to do beyond that. They're not the same thing, and I'm not confusing them." He held her gaze. The wind pushed at the barn walls. "All right," he said. "Good." She picked the harness back up. "There's coffee in the house if you want some." He went and got coffee. He sat at the kitchen table alone and drank it and tried to think about fences and cattle and weather and all the practical matters that required his attention. He was, broadly speaking, unsuccessful. Outside, the Montana winter pressed down on everything with its absolute indifference. Inside, the house was warm. That was new. He noticed it and filed it away in the place where he put things he wasn't ready to look at directly. And he went to bed, and he lay in the dark for a while thinking about a woman with oil on her cheek working on a cracked harness in his barn because she'd noticed it needed doing, and he didn't examine the feeling that produced, just acknowledged that there was one and left it alone for now. He was very good at leaving things alone. He would not be able to do it much longer. January came in like something that had been waiting all year to show what it was capable of. The cold that settled over Black Hollow in the first week of the new year was not the ordinary cold of a Montana winter, the kind people had built their lives around managing. This was something older and meaner, the kind that split fence posts and froze water in pipes inside the walls, and made the air itself feel dangerous to breathe too deeply. Thaddeus had seen winters like this before. He recognized the particular quality of the silence they produced, how sound itself seemed to freeze and fall, how the world contracted to just the immediate, what was in front of you, what needed to be kept alive today. Right now, this hour, the cattle were his first priority. Always. 32 head that needed feed broken out of frozen storage every morning. Water hauled from the creek where he'd kept a section open with an axe, checks throughout the day to make sure no animal had gone down in the cold. He had the boys help where they safely could, though he kept them close to the house when the temperature dropped to the places that made extremities dangerous. He drove himself harder than was wise and knew it and did it anyway, because the ranch was all he had, and the ranch needed him. What he didn't account for was getting hurt. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into January, not through carelessness, but through the simple mathematics of exhaustion and ice. He was repairing a section of fence on the east side of the property where a post had heaved out of the frozen ground, the kind of repair that took 2 men comfortably and 1 man, with effort, alone. He was working the post back into position, leveraging his full weight against it, when his boot found a patch of ice under the snow, and he went down hard. The post came with him. He felt the impact in his left shoulder and his knee simultaneously, and lay in the snow for a moment, assessing the damage with the cold practicality of a man who can't afford to be seriously injured. His shoulder moved. His knee held weight, barely, when he tested it. Nothing broken, he decided. Everything hurt, which was different from broken. He got himself back to the house by midday, moving slowly, unwilling to show how badly the knee was bothering him until he sat down at the kitchen table and couldn't quite conceal the difficulty of that either. Eliza was there. She looked at him once, then looked at his leg, then said, without any of the alarm that would have irritated him, "What happened?" "Fell. Ice under the east fence." "How bad?" "I'm walking." "That's not what I asked." He gave her a look that would have stopped a conversation with most people. She wasn't most people. She was already crouching down to look at his knee with the same matter-of-fact assessment she'd applied to the harness, the horses, the cracked window pane. She pressed 2 fingers along the side of the knee, and he pulled a sharp breath through his teeth that he'd meant to keep quiet. "That's not a strain," she said. "You tore something." "I haven't seen a doctor." "I haven't either, but I've seen enough ranch injuries to know the difference between something that hurts and something that's wrong." She stood up. "You need to stay off it." "I've got 32 head that need—" "I'll do the morning feed," she said. He stared at her. "You don't know the feed rotation." "Then tell me the feed rotation." She said it the way she said most things, not combatively, just as a simple statement of the obvious next step. "Write it down if it's complicated. I can read." "It's not—" He stopped. He was trying to construct an argument against this and finding that the argument kept colliding with the reality that he genuinely could not put full weight on his knee and the cattle needed feeding in the morning regardless. "It's not complicated," he said finally. "The rotation." "Good." She turned to start coffee. "Write it down anyway so I don't miss anything." He wrote it down. He sat at his own kitchen table with his knee elevated on a second chair and wrote out the feed schedule while his knee throbbed and the wind hit the house from the northwest, and he felt, in a way that sat uncomfortably with a man of his particular nature, that he was being looked after. He didn't like it, and he was grateful for it, and he didn't know what to do with that combination, so he handed her the paper and said nothing about any of it. She fed the cattle in the morning. She was out before first light and back an hour and a half later with ice on her coat and her face red from the cold and a report delivered without dramatics. All 32 accounted for, one water trough needed breaking out again. The hay in the northwest corner of the barn was getting low, and he'd want to look at his reserves. He hadn't expected her to be that thorough. He should have by now. He kept expecting less from her, and she kept delivering more, and the gap between what he expected and what he received was becoming its own kind of problem. "You checked the herd count yourself?" he asked. 3 times, she said, pouring herself coffee. "I know I'm not you. I know I might miss something, so I counted 3 times. He was quiet for a moment. "The northwest corner hay. We've got enough." "For how long?" He calculated. 6 weeks, if the winter breaks when it usually does. "And if it doesn't?" "Then I'll need to buy from Briggs." He paused. "But it usually breaks." She nodded. She sat down across the table from him with her coffee, and for a few minutes they were just 2 people in a cold house at early morning, and it was comfortable in a way that Thaddeus noticed and chose not to examine too directly. He kept his weight off the knee for 4 days. This was not entirely voluntary. On the second day, he tried to go out and do the fence repair himself, and made it approximately 50 yards from the house before the knee informed him clearly that it had opinions about this plan. He went back inside. Eliza said nothing when he came back through the door, just moved so he could get to his chair without navigating around her, and went on with what she'd been doing. "You didn't say anything," he said. She glanced up. "About what?" "About me trying to go out and coming back." "Was there something to say?" He almost laughed. Almost. "Most people would say something." "Most people aren't me." She went back to whatever she was doing. "You tried. Your knee said no. You came inside. That seems like the right sequence of events to me." He sat with that for a moment. There was something about the way she dealt with his stubbornness. Not challenging it, not accommodating it, just sort of letting it exhaust itself against the wall of her own practicality. That was genuinely new to him. Margaret had argued with him. The people he'd employed before either capitulated or left. Eliza did something different. She just continued, steadily, and let him figure things out at his own pace. He was beginning to understand a very effective approach. During those 4 days, she ran the morning and evening livestock checks herself, kept the house, managed the boys' schoolwork on the days weather kept them home, and also, somewhere in the evenings when the work was done, managed to repair a loose board on the back porch that had been catching people's feet for 2 years. He noticed the repair on the 3rd day when he was moving carefully across the porch and didn't catch his boot on the edge that usually caught it. He stood there for a moment looking at the new board, planed smooth and set flush. "When did you do this?" he asked, back inside. She didn't look up. "Day before yesterday. Board was bad. It was going to go all the way through eventually, and someone was going to fall." "Where'd you learn to do carpentry?" A brief pause. Something moved across her face, quick and private. "My father wasn't particular about which of us learned what," she said. "He had 4 daughters and no sons, and he needed help with the property, so we all learned what needed learning." This was the most she'd told him about herself in 3 months. He understood by the tone of it that there was more to the story and that she wasn't going to tell it right now. He didn't push. "It's good work," he said. "It's a porch board," she said. But he caught something in her expression, quick and gone, that said the acknowledgement had landed somewhere. The boys watched all of this. Children notice things adults don't realize they're noticing, particularly children who have learned to pay close attention to the adults around them as a survival strategy. Samuel watched openly, with the uncomplicated approval of a child who had decided Eliza was good, and saw additional evidence of this at every turn. Nolan watched differently, sideways, cataloging, his expression giving nothing away, but he'd started talking to her. Not much. Not about anything important at first, small observations. A question about something he'd read. A comment about one of the horses. Small offerings extended carefully, like testing whether a surface would hold weight before committing to step on it. And she received each one the same way, directly, genuinely, without making a production of the fact that he was talking to her at all, which he would have found suffocating. She just talked to him like he was a person who had said a thing and she was a person responding to it. No performance, no careful handling. One evening near the end of January, Nolan stayed after supper without being asked. This itself was notable. He usually retreated to his room or the barn the moment supper was finished, but he sat at the table with his book while Eliza cleared plates, and after a while he said, not quite casually, "She used to make that? What you made tonight?" Eliza stopped moving. She understood immediately who he meant. She set the plate she was holding down carefully. "The potato soup," she said. Neutral, just confirming. "Yeah." He was looking at the table. "With the dill. She got the dill from Mrs. Briggs. She didn't grow it herself. She never could keep herbs going." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, brief and painful. "She tried every year." Eliza sat down. Not across from him, which would have felt confrontational, but at the near end of the table, sideways, as if she just happened to stop there. "What else did she try to grow?" she asked. And Nolan talked, haltingly at first, then with more momentum, about Margaret's garden and her opinions about it, and the specific way she'd had of arguing with Thaddeus about the best place for the bean rows, about how she'd smelled like lavender she kept in a small sachet in her coat pocket, about the song she'd hummed without knowing she was humming it when she was washing dishes. Small details, the kind that don't survive grief well, the first to disappear, the last to be recovered. He talked for almost an hour. Eliza listened and asked small questions and didn't once say anything about how Margaret must be watching over them, or that she was somewhere peaceful now. The things adults say to grieving children that make the children feel like the adults haven't understood anything at all. She just listened to who Margaret had been as a person, as a specific human being, and Nolan could feel that she was actually hearing it. When he finally ran out of things to say, there was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Then he picked up his book. "She would have thought you were all right," he said. Very quiet, not looking at her. "Mama, she was pretty good at telling what people were." Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the tabletop. "That means something," she said, simple and honest. And he nodded once, already getting up, already retreating back behind the 12-year-old wall he'd built. But the wall had a door in it now, and they both knew it. Thaddeus heard none of this directly. He'd been in the other room, his knee propped up, reading the same page of the same book for the 4th time because his concentration kept dissolving. But he heard the sound of it, the murmur of conversation from the kitchen, Nolan's voice going longer than usual, and then the footsteps on the stairs. He set the book down. The fire in the front room crackled and settled. Through the wall he could hear Eliza moving in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of a house being put to rights for the night. He sat with a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to peace, uncomfortable in its unfamiliarity, like a coat worn by someone else that fits surprisingly well, and you're not sure whether to keep wearing it or hang it back up. He hung it back up. It was easier that way. He was still very good at that, but the coat fit, and he knew it. February came, and the winter that had been brutal became briefly cruel in the way that only February could manage. A week of warmth that was almost spring, enough to make everything soft and hopeful, followed immediately by a storm that made January look mild. It came in 2 days before the end of the month, and it came fast. Thaddeus was out with the cattle when the sky changed. He felt the shift in the air before he could see it clearly, a particular pressure, a different quality to the cold, the horses going uneasy in a way that was its own kind of weather instrument. He started moving the herd toward the lower pasture, closer to the barn, pushing them faster than he wanted to because the sky to the northwest was turning a color that had no good news in it. He made it. Barely. He got the herd into the lower pasture and got himself to the barn just as the wind hit, and the wind this time was different. Not the usual cold cut of a Montana winter night, but something with actual weight behind it, the kind of wind that you could lean into and feel it push back, the kind that made you think about the structural integrity of things. He spent an hour in the barn securing what needed to be secured, talking to the horses in the low, continuous way that kept them calm when they were afraid, and when he finally moved toward the house, it was through a wall of snow that had already reduced visibility to about 10 feet. He kept his hand on the rope line he'd strung between the barn and the house 3 winters ago for exactly this reason and made it to the back door by feel more than sight. Inside, the house was lit and warm in a way that hit him physically after the cold. Every lamp was going, the stove was built up high. He stood in the back doorway dripping snow and ice and couldn't immediately see Eliza, then found her. She was in the front room with both boys, and she had pulled every blanket in the house and was building what appeared to be a structure of considerable ambition against the interior wall, away from the windows, with the specific logic of someone who understood that if this got bad enough, the warmest room would need to be the designated space. She saw him and said, "The northwest window in your room is leaking cold. I've packed it, but you should know." He nodded, still catching his breath. "Herd's in the lower pasture." "Good." She handed Samuel another blanket to add to the structure. "There's food on the stove. Eat something." He ate standing up, watching her manage the situation with the boys. Samuel was treating the whole thing as a considerable adventure, which was 8 years old for you. Nolan was more measured, but he was helping, handing things, doing what she asked without the resentful performance of a boy complying against his will. The storm ran through the night and into the next day. They stayed mostly together, in the front room and the kitchen, in the way that extreme weather forces proximity and makes ordinary distances feel silly. They played cards, which Thaddeus was bad at, and Samuel was inexplicably good at for his age. Nolan read. Eliza mended things and occasionally looked out the window at the white nothing and did her weather calculations quietly. At some point in the middle of that long night, Samuel fell asleep against Eliza's shoulder, his mouth open, completely abandoned to sleep the way children are. She didn't move to shift him. She sat still with the small boy's weight against her and continued what she was doing one-handed. And Thaddeus, sitting across from her, watched this and felt something pull tight in his chest that he had no clean name for. Nolan, from his chair, was watching too. He met his father's eyes briefly and looked away with the expression of a 12-year-old who has understood something the adults in the room haven't said yet. The storm broke by morning. The world outside was buried and still and blindingly white, the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. They dug out slowly over 3 days. The ranch had taken damage. Part of the roof over the chicken coop had collapsed. One section of the east fence was gone again, and they'd lost 2 laying hens. It could have been considerably worse. On the 3rd day of digging out, Eliza was helping clear the path between the house and the barn. Real work, physical work, with a shovel. When Thaddeus came around the corner and stopped. She'd been at it for a while. Her back was turned and she was working steadily, not fast but consistently, with the body knowledge of someone who understood how to manage effort over a long task. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to before picking up the second shovel and joining her without comment. They worked side by side for an hour, not talking much, just the sound of the shovels and the cold and their breath in the air. At one point, the work required them to move a particularly heavy drift at the barn door, and she braced one way and he braced the other, and for a moment they were close, closer than usual, both leaning into the same problem. She glanced at him sideways. "Together?" "Together," he said. They shifted the drift. He thought about that word for the rest of the day, in the specific way a man thinks about a thing when he's trying not to think about it. Together. It was just a word about a snowbank. He knew that. He also knew it wasn't only that, and the gap between those two things was where Thaddeus Crow lived now. In the distance between what he could admit and what he already knew, doing what he'd always done. Working the land, running the ranch, keeping everything moving, and hoping the feelings he hadn't decided what to do with would have the decency to wait. They didn't. But he didn't know that yet. Spring came to Black Hollow the way it always did. Not as an arrival, but as a slow argument between seasons, winter refusing to concede what spring was trying to claim. The snow pulled back in patches, revealing ground that looked shocked to see sunlight again. The mud came next, the particular Montana mud that could swallow a boot to the ankle. If you stepped wrong, that made every path between the house and the barn a negotiation. The cattle moved differently when the cold broke, restless and sideways, feeling something in the air that the humans around them were feeling too, that loosening of the chest that comes when survival stops being the only thing on the agenda. Thaddeus noticed the change in the ranch before he noticed it in himself. The fences that had held through the winter now needed proper assessment, not emergency repairs but deliberate work, the kind that required planning. The herd needed moving to the north pasture where the early grass was coming in. The kitchen garden that had been buried under 4 months of snow needed turning if they were going to get anything planted before the season got away from them. There was always more work than hours, but spring work had a different quality to it. It was forward-facing. It felt, cautiously, like building something. Eliza went at the kitchen garden with a purpose that surprised him. He'd expected her to manage the house through spring the same way she'd managed it through winter, competently, steadily, without drama. What he didn't expect was to come around the side of the house one morning in late March and find her already knee-deep in the process of turning the beds, working a spade through the compacted earth with the kind of committed physical effort that left no room for anything decorative about the scene. Her coat was off despite the cold. There was mud on her hands past the wrist. He stopped. "You know how to garden?" She didn't look up. "My mother's domain," she said, working the spade through a stubborn section. She had opinions about soil, strong ones. "The garden's been gone since—" He stopped. She did look up then briefly. "Since Mrs. Crow," she said. Not a question. Matter of fact, the way she handled the topics other people tiptoed around. 4 years, he said. She looked at the bed she was working, then back at him. What did she grow? He thought about it. He hadn't thought about the garden in a long time. Beans, carrots. She had a thing about cucumbers, though they never did well out here. Herbs, the dill especially. He paused, remembering something Nolan had said in the kitchen in January. She got the dill from Hal Briggs' wife. Eliza nodded. I'll ask Mrs. Briggs if she still has starts. That was all she said about it. She went back to the earth. He went on to the fences, carrying that small exchange with him through the morning. The ease of it, the way she'd navigated the mention of Margaret without making him feel like he was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Other people got careful when Margaret came up. They softened their voices or changed the subject, or gave him that particular look of concern that always made him feel worse rather than better. Eliza just absorbed the information and incorporated it and moved on, the same way she did everything. He noticed, working the east fence line that afternoon, that he'd talked to her more in the past 6 months than he'd talked to any living person since Margaret died. That wasn't hard to surpass. He'd been running a 4-year experiment in keeping people at a functional distance and had become quite expert at it. But the quantity wasn't the thing that troubled him. It was the quality of it, how little effort it took, how he didn't spend 10 minutes after their conversations cataloging what he should or shouldn't have said. He just talked to her and then went on with his day, and that was apparently what normal human conversation felt like, and he had forgotten. This was around the time Hal Briggs came by. Hal had a quality shared by very few people Thaddeus had ever known, of appearing at the precise moment when his observations would be most unwelcome and most accurate. He showed up on a Friday in early April with a calf he'd been holding through the winter that belonged on the Crow ledger, and stayed for coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the comfortable permanence of a man who had earned his place there over 30 years of neighboring. Eliza was in the house. She brought coffee, said hello to Hal with the direct warmth that seemed to be her natural register with people she had no reason to distrust, and then went on with her work with the clear intention of giving them space. Hal watched her go and then looked at Thaddeus with an expression that required no translation. Don't, Thaddeus said. I haven't said a thing. You're about to. Hal wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. She turned your garden, he said, looking through the window at where the beds were now clearly delineated and partially planted. Margaret couldn't get you to touch that garden with a 10-foot pole. Said you were constitutionally opposed to anything that grew on a schedule you couldn't control. I didn't turn it. She turned it. I know who turned it. Hal looked at him. That's rather the point. Thaddeus didn't say anything. He turned his own coffee cup on the table. The boys look different, Hal said, in the tone of a man making clinical observations. Nolan especially. He's got some color back. He's 12. He's fine. He wasn't fine 6 months ago. Hal said this without cruelty, just accuracy. He looked like a boy who'd decided the world was a place to be endured. He doesn't look like that right now. A pause. She's done something there. She's done her job. Hal looked at him with 62 years of lived experience behind his eyes. Thaddeus, he said, not unkindly, I've known you 19 years. I know what it looks like when you're managing, and I know what it looks like when you're living. Right now you're somewhere between the two, which is progress. He picked up his hat from the table. That's all I'm saying. He left without saying anything else. He didn't need to. Hal Briggs had always understood that the best thing you could do with a stubborn man was plant the idea and walk away and let the ground do the rest. The idea grew, as ideas do when they're planted in soil that's been ready for them longer than the planter knew. It grew specifically on a Wednesday in April when Thaddeus came back from the far pasture at midday. An unusual hour, but he'd forgotten the fence stakes he needed and had to come back for them, and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment before anyone saw him. Eliza was at the table with Samuel. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what they were doing. Samuel was showing her something he'd drawn, a series of pictures on 3 pieces of paper that appeared to tell some kind of story, and she was looking at them with a focus that was entirely real, asking him questions about them. Samuel was explaining with the total physical commitment that 8-year-olds bring to things they care about, leaning over the table, pointing, talking fast. "But why does the horse have that face here?" Eliza was asking, pointing at one of the drawings. "Because he's worried," Samuel said, with the authority of the artist who knows exactly what he intended. "He knows the other horses are going to the valley, but he can't go because he hurt his leg and he doesn't know if they'll come back." "Does he know how to tell them that?" Samuel considered this seriously. "He doesn't. Horses can't talk. That's the whole problem." "That's a real problem," she said. "What does he do about it?" Samuel picked up his pencil. "I haven't figured that part out yet." "Well," she said, that's the most important part. Take your time with it." He nodded gravely and went back to drawing. She watched him for a moment with an expression that Thaddeus caught from the doorway before he stepped back. Something in her face that was unguarded in a way she never was when she knew she was being observed. A kind of specific tenderness. The expression of a woman who had been careful not to attach herself too deeply to things that might not hold, discovering that she had attached herself anyway. Thaddeus stepped back from the door without his fence stakes. He stood on the porch for a moment looking out at the land, and he made himself be honest with himself in the way that required effort. He had told himself, for months, that what he felt when he thought about Eliza was gratitude, appreciation for competent work, the natural warmth of a man towards someone who had made his difficult life somewhat less difficult. He had filed everything else, the barn at night, the hand across the table, the word together in the snow, under the category of things that were understandable but inadvisable to pursue. Standing on the porch in April, he acknowledged that he had been managing his own feelings with the same strategy he used for fence repairs that he couldn't get to yet. He'd identified the problem, assessed that it wasn't immediately catastrophic, and left it for later. The problem was that later had arrived. He went back for the fence stakes by a different route. Spring moved forward. The garden took hold, not uniformly, not without setbacks, because this was Black Hollow, and the earth didn't simply cooperate, but with enough success that green things were visible by May, and Eliza had apparently established a correspondence with Mrs. Briggs about the dill that resulted in a small package arriving with the Briggs' youngest on a Tuesday, which Eliza planted in the east corner where the light was right with the care of someone returning something to where it belonged. Nolan saw this from the fence where he'd been watching and said nothing, but he stayed where he was for a while, looking at the small planted corner, and his face did something complicated that he didn't try to explain. The first real conversation between them, not the careful exchanges of a boy testing for safety, but an actual conversation about an actual thing, happened on a Saturday in May when Nolan found her in the barn, not doing anything that required being in the barn, just standing near the bay mare's stall with her hand on the mare's nose, the horse leaning into it with the specific trust that horses extend only to people they've decided are worth it. He came in to get a halter and stopped when he saw her. He almost left. Instead, he walked past her to the tack wall, got the halter, turned to go, and then didn't go. "She wouldn't let me near her the first month," Eliza said, without turning around. She knew he was there. She usually did. She'd move to the back of the stall every time. "She's like that," Nolan said, "with new people." "What changed her mind?" He came a few steps closer despite himself. "She doesn't trust fast, but if you keep showing up and you don't try to push it, eventually she figures out you're not going anywhere." He paused. "Mama said that horse was like Dad, stubborn until she trusted you, and then completely." Eliza smiled at the mare's ear, not at Nolan. "That's a fair description of your father." Nolan almost smiled. He caught it and redirected. "What was your father like?" he asked, and then looked like he hadn't intended to say it. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, but of someone deciding how honest to be. Hard, she said finally, but fair. He expected a lot. When you met his expectations, he didn't say much, but you knew. She ran her hand down the mare's nose. He died when I was 22. After that, I was mostly on my own. Nolan absorbed this. He turned the halter over in his hands. Is that why you came here? Because you had nowhere... He stopped himself. You can say it, she said. It's true. He looked at her back. Is that the only reason you stayed? She turned around then. She looked at him directly, the way she always did, without any softening of the thing she was about to say. No, she said. It's not. He held her look for a moment. He was 12, but he was a 12 who had learned to read adults for the gap between what they said and what they meant. And he was reading her now and finding, apparently, that the gap was small. Okay, he said. Simple. And he went out with the halter. She stood in the barn for another few minutes, her hand on the mare's nose, feeling the particular weight of that short exchange. She had not come here planning to belong anywhere. She had come here to work and survive the winter and stay on if the terms held, the way a person plans when they have learned not to plan further than the current necessity. And somewhere in the winter, in the kitchen at night, and the barn at dawn in the long days of a hard season, she had made the mistake, if it was a mistake, of letting herself matter to these people and letting them matter back. She was not certain what to do with that. She was even less certain what to do with Thaddeus, who had been looking at her differently for weeks in a way he clearly didn't realize she noticed. She noticed everything. That was both a skill and, in this particular situation, a complication, because what she saw when she looked at him carefully was a man in the process of arriving at something he hadn't decided yet whether to allow. She knew better than to push it. She knew men like Thaddeus, the particular architecture of their pride, built not from arrogance but from years of having no one to lean on, which produced a self-reliance so thorough it had become indistinguishable from the self. He would arrive when he arrived, or he wouldn't. She went back to the house. That same week, something happened that the whole ranch felt without anyone naming it. Thaddeus came in from the field late, later than usual, and supper had been held and was now at the stage of warm rather than hot, and everyone was at the table already, both boys and Eliza, who had the habit of eating with the family that had evolved gradually and organically over the winter until nobody thought anything of it anymore. The four of them around the table had stopped being notable and become simply the way supper was. He sat down. He took in the table, the food, his sons, Eliza passing Samuel the bread, and something crossed his face that was there and gone before anyone could be sure they'd seen it. He picked up his fork. He ate. After supper, when the boys had gone up and Eliza was washing dishes, he said, from the table where he was still sitting with the last of his coffee, "The Hendersons are selling the property at the south edge." She looked over her shoulder. "The one with the creek access?" "That's the one." "Are you thinking of buying it?" "Thinking about it." He turned his cup on the table. "It would mean more work, more fence line. Probably need to hire on a hand in the summer." He paused. "Ranch would be bigger than I've run it before." She turned back to the dishes. "You could run it," she said. "Not a compliment. Just a statement of assessment from someone who had watched him run this ranch through one of the worst winters in recent memory and had her own clear-eyed view of what he was capable of." He was quiet for a moment. "It would mean things being more permanent," he said, "not just running through, building toward something." She kept her hands in the dishwater. She understood that they had stopped talking about the Henderson property. She was not sure she was ready for where the conversation was going, and she was not sure he was either, and she was not the kind of woman who moved toward something half-formed just because she wanted it. "Permanent's not a bad word," she said carefully. "No," he said. "I'm realizing that." He got up, put his cup by the sink, said goodnight, and went upstairs. She stood at the sink for a long moment after she heard his door. Outside, the Montana spring was finally, irrevocably, winning its argument with winter. The last ice was gone from the creek. The north pasture was green. The dill in the east corner of the garden was showing its first tentative inches above the soil, small and determined, exactly where Eliza had put it. She finished the dishes. She turned down the lamps. She went to her room at the back of the house that had stopped feeling temporary sometime around January, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening in this house, to these people, to her, without talking herself out of it or managing it into something safer. It was a lot to feel. She felt it anyway. Some things didn't benefit from being managed. June arrived and the ranch breathed differently. The Henderson property deal closed on a Thursday, which Thaddeus handled in town with a handshake and a signed paper, and came home quieter than usual. Not the quiet of a troubled man, but the quiet of one who has made a decision and is now living inside it. He told Eliza over supper that it was done, and she nodded and said that was good. And Samuel wanted to know if the Henderson Creek had fish in it, and Nolan asked about the fence condition on the south boundary, and the conversation moved on the way conversations do at a table where people have real things to discuss. What didn't move on was the feeling in the house. Something had shifted after the night Thaddeus said permanent wasn't a bad word, and then walked upstairs rather than finish what he'd started. They had not spoken directly about it since, but the unspoken thing had weight and shape now, and both of them were aware of it the way you're aware of a piece of furniture in a dark room. You navigate around it without looking at it directly, but it informs every step. He caught himself doing things he hadn't done in years. Coming in from the field at a reasonable hour instead of working until his body simply stopped cooperating. Sitting at the table after supper with his coffee instead of taking it to the front room alone. Asking questions, real ones, not the transactional exchanges of an employer checking in, about how she was, what she was thinking, whether something was working the way she'd hoped. He noticed himself doing these things and felt a mix of emotions he couldn't cleanly separate. Something warm, something afraid, and something that was almost anger at himself for having wasted so much time inside the efficient misery of the last 4 years. The boys noticed. Of course they did. Samuel noticed the way he noticed everything, which was directly and without any awareness that noticing was something one might want to be discreet about. Dad laughed at supper, he reported to Eliza one morning, with the specific tone of a naturalist documenting a rare sighting. She was braiding her hair at the small mirror in the kitchen and caught his reflection in it. "He did," she said. "He doesn't do that." "He used to, I'd imagine." Samuel considered this. Nolan says he laughed all the time before Mama got sick. I don't really remember. He picked up a biscuit from the pan cooling on the counter, earned himself a look from Eliza, and put half of it back. "Do you think he's happy?" She tied off her braid. She thought about how to answer a question from an 8-year-old honestly, without making it carry more than 8-year-old shoulders could hold. "I think he's getting there," she said. Samuel ate the half biscuit. "I think so too," he said, with the satisfied authority of a child who has reached a conclusion he's been working toward for a while. The thing that actually broke it open happened on a Wednesday evening in the middle of June at the supper table, in a way that nobody planned and nobody could have anticipated. It had been an ordinary day, long, hot, the summer work well underway with a hired hand named Cooper, who came 3 days a week and was young and willing and moderately competent, which was better than nothing. Thaddeus had been working with Cooper on the new fence line along the Henderson boundary. Eliza had been managing the house and had also, sometime in the early afternoon, ridden out to check on the north herd because she'd noticed that morning that the gate latch on that pasture had been loose and wanted to confirm it hadn't swung open in the afternoon wind. She had not mentioned to Thaddeus that she was going to do this. He found out at supper when he made an offhand reference to needing to check that gate tomorrow morning, and she said she'd already ridden out and fixed the latch and all 38 head were where they should be, and he stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You rode out to the north pasture," he said. "This afternoon the latch was going up. I figured it was better to check than to find out tomorrow morning that's a 2-hour ride. Hour and a half the way I went." He set his fork down. "Eliza, that's not— I know it's not in the arrangement," she said, with the quiet patience of a woman who had said a version of this before. "I know what my job is. I also know what needed doing." There was a silence at the table. Samuel was looking back and forth between them with his mouth slightly open. Nolan was very still, watching his father with an expression of concentrated attention. And then Nolan said, "Why haven't you married her?" The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. It landed on the table like something dropped from a height. Not aggressive, not manipulative, just a 12-year-old saying the thing that had apparently been sitting in his chest waiting for the right moment, delivered with the specific flatness of a boy who had decided that the adults were taking too long and someone needed to say it. Thaddeus looked at his son. He opened his mouth and closed it again. "Nolan," Eliza started. "Mrs. Briggs asked me last week," Nolan continued, still in that same flat, precise voice, "if my father was planning to marry you before someone else figured out he should." I didn't know what to say. He picked up his fork. "People in town think you're already a family. I heard Mr. Garner say it to someone at the feed store. He said, 'The Crow family,' and he meant all four of us." Samuel, who had been following this with the expression of someone watching a very important event unfold, said, "I told Tommy Briggs you were like our mother, but different. He said that made sense." Nobody spoke for a moment. Thaddeus was looking at the table. He had gone very still in the way of a man whose interior landscape has just been rearranged without his permission. His jaw was working slightly, not like he was about to speak, but like he was keeping himself from saying several things at once. Eliza was looking at her plate. She felt heat in her face and was furious at herself for it. She had not seen this coming, had thought Nolan's progress meant he was getting more comfortable, not that he was working his way toward a supper table ambush, however well-intentioned. "Nolan," she said, steady, "that's not a question you ask at the supper table." "Then when do you ask it?" Nolan said. He wasn't being rude. He was genuinely asking. "It seems like the kind of thing people keep not saying, and I don't understand why." Thaddeus looked up from the table. He looked at Nolan for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza, and this time he didn't look away. And the thing in his face was different from anything she'd seen there before. Not the careful, managed quality of a man keeping himself in check, but something unguarded and direct and almost pained. "Go finish your supper," he said to the boys. His voice was even. "Both of you." They finished their supper. They were sent upstairs shortly after. Samuel fizzing with barely contained energy, and Nolan moving with the careful deliberateness of a boy who felt he had set something in motion and was now uncertain whether that had been wise. Their footsteps crossed the ceiling above the kitchen. A door closed. Thaddeus and Eliza were alone at the table. He hadn't moved from his chair. She started to clear the plates, mostly because she needed something to do with her hands, and she got as far as stacking two of them before he said, quietly, "Eliza." She stopped. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that unguarded expression still on his face, like he'd stopped being able to assemble the one he usually wore and hadn't yet decided whether to try. "I don't know how to do this," he said, flat and honest, the way he was when he'd stopped managing. "I want you to know that before I say anything else. I'm not good at this." "I know that," she said. "I've been—" He stopped, started again. "There are things I've been aware of for a while that I haven't said. Because I've been trying to be careful. Because the last time He pressed his hand flat on the table. "Because I don't know what you feel, and I didn't want to make something harder that was already working." She was quiet. She gave him the space to finish. "The contract between us ended 6 months ago," he said. "You know that." "I know. You stayed." A pause. "I know you needed the work. I know that's part of it. I'm not—" He looked frustrated with himself, and she recognized the frustration of a man trying to say something important and running into all the places where language isn't built for what he means. "I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm not asking for anything. I'm trying to tell you something true." She waited. He looked at her steadily. "This house, whatever it is now, it's because of you. Not because of what you've done, though you've done more than I had any right to expect, but because of who you are when you're doing it. The way you've been with Nolan, what you've given Samuel, the way you ride out to check a gate latch at midday because you noticed it was loose, and you just do it, because that's who you are." He stopped. He was not comfortable with this level of exposure. She could see that. He was sitting in it anyway. "I fell in love with you somewhere in the middle of the worst winter this ranch has seen in 10 years, he said. "I want to say it was a surprise, but I think the honest answer is that I was the last one to know." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the June evening was long and gold and indifferent, the way Montana evenings are. Eliza looked at him. She felt the full weight of what he'd just done. A man who treated vulnerability like a wound to be kept covered, sitting across a kitchen table and bleeding on purpose because he'd finally decided it was worth the cost. She was not going to be careless with that. I need to ask you something, she said. He nodded. His expression said he'd expected a question and was prepared for it to be hard. Do you know the difference between wanting someone to stay because she's useful and wanting her to stay because she's her? He held her gaze without flinching. Yes, he said. I know the difference. And you're sure which one this is? I'm sure. She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent months reading this man. His silences, his oblique approaching of things, the places where he held back and the places where he let something through. She read him now and found him clear. Then I'm going to say something true back, she said. I came here with nowhere to go. That's fact, and I'm not going to dress it up. But I would have left, Thaddeus. I've left before when a situation wasn't right, no matter how much I needed the work. I stayed because this is... She stopped, which was unusual for her, and he saw that it cost her the same thing it had cost him. Because this is the first place in years that has felt like it was mine in some way. Not because it is mine, because the people in it started to feel like mine. He was very still. The boys, she said, and you. He let out a slow breath. His hand on the table moved, not reaching for anything, just releasing some tension it had been holding. Eliza, he said, and then he stopped, and something that wasn't quite a question crossed his face. Yes, she said, before he could find the words for it. She knew what he was asking. He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the almost smile of a man who has caught himself before going further, but an actual, complete, unguarded expression of relief, the kind that only appears when a person has been carrying something alone for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. I should probably ask you properly, he said. You don't have to do it in the kitchen, she said. I'm asking you right now, kitchen or not. He straightened in the chair, and she could see him organizing himself for it. Not performing it, just making sure it was said clearly, the way he made sure important things were said clearly. Marry me. Not because the ranch needs managing, and not because the boys need a woman in the house, though you are the best thing that has ever happened to them. Because I would like to spend whatever years I've got left waking up in a house where you're in it. Because you've changed what this place is, and I don't want to go back to what it was. She looked at him. She thought about the cracked satchel she'd carried in 8 months ago, the mud on her boots, the 2-month trial she'd accepted because she had no leverage to ask for more. She thought about every calculated risk she'd made in her life, the ones that had failed and the ones that had held, and the difference between them, and whether this particular risk was the kind that held. She thought about a 12-year-old boy talking about his mother's dill in a kitchen at night, and a small boy's drawings of a horse that couldn't tell the others what he felt, and a man who had spent 4 years walled inside his own survival and was now sitting across from her having voluntarily taken the wall apart. Yes, she said, just that. The same word she'd given him before, when he'd asked something he couldn't quite put into language, but this time both of them knew exactly what it meant. He nodded, once, the nod of a man receiving information he'd needed and accepting it completely. He didn't move immediately. He sat with it for a moment, in that way he had, absorbing things before he acted on them. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held it, and they stayed like that in the kitchen of a ranch in Montana in the long light of a June evening, neither of them saying anything, because the conversation had already said what needed saying. Upstairs there was the unmistakable sound of 2 boys who had been listening at the top of the stairs, a shuffled footstep, a quickly suppressed noise that might have been Samuel beginning to say something and being shushed by his brother. Thaddeus looked at the ceiling. They've been up there the whole time, he said. Yes, she said. She had known since the first dropped footstep 10 minutes into the conversation. I should probably give them a minute, she said. Samuel needs to finish celebrating quietly before he can come down and not look like he was listening. He looked at her. And Nolan? She thought about a boy in a barn asking if she'd stayed for reasons beyond necessity, and the answer she'd given him, and the way he'd nodded once and left with the halter. Nolan already knows, she said. He's been waiting for you to catch up. Something crossed his face, pride and grief and love all at once, the complicated mixture that parenthood produces in the people willing to feel it honestly. He's a better man than I've been, Thaddeus said, very quietly. He learned from you, she said. The patience, the watching, The figuring out who someone is before you decide to trust them. She looked at him steadily. He did what you do. It just took him less time because he had fewer walls to work through. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. That might be the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me. I have my moments, she said. He almost smiled. Then it became an actual smile, slow and real, the kind that changes a face rather than decorating it. She looked at it and thought, there it is. There's the man who used to laugh at supper. From the top of the stairs came the sound of Samuel completely failing to contain himself any longer, and then Nolan's low voice saying something sharp and quiet, and then footsteps. And Samuel appeared at the bottom of the stairs at a speed suggesting he had held himself back as long as was physically possible, his face brilliant with barely managed delight, looking between them with the expression of a child who has gotten exactly what he wanted and cannot believe his luck. Did you ask her? He demanded. Thaddeus looked at his younger son with an expression that would have 6 months ago been impossible on his face. Go to bed, Samuel. But did you see... Samuel. But there was no real authority in it. There was, barely hidden behind the deliberate sternness, exactly the thing he'd accused himself of having lost. Samuel looked at Eliza. She looked back at him and gave him nothing, just watched him the way she always had, steady and real, which was by now its own kind of answer. He grinned so hard it looked like it might hurt. He went to bed. Thaddeus Crowe was not a man who did things halfway. Once he'd made up his mind about the Henderson land, he'd moved on it within a week. Once he'd decided a fence post was failing, he replaced it that same day rather than patch it and wait. It was the same quality that had built the ranch from raw ground and held it through years that would have broken men with less absolute commitment to seeing a thing through. So when he told Eliza he wanted to marry her, the word that carried the most weight wasn't marry. It was want. Thaddeus didn't want things carelessly. When he said the word, it meant he'd already examined the question from every angle available to him and arrived at the answer with the same certainty he brought to everything else. That didn't make the days that followed simple. Simple was not a word that applied to two people who had spent the better part of a year being carefully professional with each other, suddenly navigating a different kind of territory in the same house, in front of the same two boys, with the same daily work still requiring attention regardless of any personal developments. The cattle still needed feeding. The Henderson fence line still needed completing. Cooper still showed up 3 days a week and needed direction. Life on a working ranch had the quality of a river. It moved whether you were ready or not, and the only question was whether you were swimming or being carried. What changed was the texture of the ordinary. He asked her about the garden in a different way now, not checking in as an employer might, but with genuine curiosity, leaning on the fence at the end of a day and watching her work the beds with the patient interest of a man who has decided that everything about a person is worth paying attention to. She caught him at it and didn't say anything, just kept working, but something about the set of her shoulders changed when she knew he was there. A small relaxing of the habitual self-containment she'd spent years maintaining. They told the boys the following morning formally, which was mostly a formality because Samuel had been conducting himself since the previous night like a child who had won something significant and was trying not to gloat too visibly about it. Thaddeus sat them down at the breakfast table and told them plainly. He had asked Eliza to marry him, and she had said yes, and he wanted to know what they thought about it. Samuel immediately said, "When?" Nolan looked at Eliza across the table with that particular 12-year-old expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they've been walking toward for a while. "You're sure?" he said. Not challenging, checking, the way he checked everything, because certainty mattered to him, and because he'd been hurt before by things that turned out to be less certain than they'd seemed. "I'm sure," she said. He nodded once. "Okay then." He picked up his fork. "Good." Samuel looked at his brother. "That's all you're going to say? What else is there to say?" "I don't know. Something." Samuel turned to his father. "So she's staying forever now?" "That's the idea," Thaddeus said. Samuel sat with this for approximately 3 seconds and then said, "Can I have another biscuit?" And that was mostly that. The announcement that had existed as an enormous unspoken weight in the house for months resolved at the breakfast table in under 5 minutes. And then everyone went on with the day, and somehow the going on with the day felt fundamentally different from every previous going on with the day, though nothing visible had changed. Hal Briggs came by 2 days later, which was either coincidence or the result of Hal having a very good information network in a small community where news traveled fast. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at Thaddeus with an expression of profound, vindicated satisfaction. "Dorothy Marsh told me this morning," he said. "Dorothy Marsh should mind her own. She told me," Hal continued undeterred, "and I told her it was about time, and she agreed, and I believe the general consensus in Black Hollow is that it's about time." He put his hat back on. "I'm glad for you, Thaddeus. I'm genuinely glad." Thaddeus looked at his old neighbor, the man who had suggested he try one more housekeeper, who had planted the observation about the garden and walked away, who had known him long enough to see the full distance he'd traveled. "Thank you, Hal," he said, and meant it without qualification, which was not something he'd done easily with anyone in a long time. The wedding was set for late July, not because they needed the time to plan anything elaborate. Neither of them had any appetite for elaborateness, but because July brought a week where the ranch work eased slightly after the spring push and before the fall one, and it seemed sensible to use it. Eliza's practical nature, the same one that had reorganized the larder and counted cattle 3 times and ridden out alone to check a gate latch, applied equally to wedding planning. What was needed, what wasn't, what would make the day real without making it a performance. What was needed, they agreed, was the Briggs family, who had been the nearest thing to extended family the Crow Ranch had for years. Dorothy Marsh, who had initially told Eliza there was work at the ranch and deserved to see where that had ended up. Cooper and his young wife, who had become comfortable on the property over the summer. And a minister from town who turned out to be a compact, practical man with a handshake like a vice grip and a mercifully brief ceremony style. What wasn't needed was everything else. Eliza had no family to invite. This was a fact she had made her peace with years ago, in the pragmatic way of someone who has learned to stop mourning what can't be changed and invest instead in what is. She had in this territory the beginning of something, which was more than she'd had when she'd stepped off Pete Garner's wagon 8 months earlier with mud on her boots and nowhere particular to go, and she understood the value of beginnings better than most. The morning of the wedding, she was up before anyone else. Old habit. She built the kitchen fire and made coffee and stood at the window in the early light looking at the garden. The beans coming in, the carrots, the herbs that had taken through the summer with more success than she'd expected, and the dill in the east corner, now full and feathery and exactly where it should be. The light came in at that particular low July angle that turned everything gold, the way light in Montana could sometimes do, suddenly and without warning, making the ordinary landscape into something that looked almost deliberately beautiful. She heard his step on the stairs. She knew it by now. The particular weight of his tread, the way he favored the left side of the 3rd step that had always creaked. "You're up," he said from the doorway. "I'm always up," she said. He came in. He looked at her at the window, and he looked at the garden, and he poured his coffee and came to stand beside her. Not performing a moment, just standing there in his own kitchen in the early morning the way he stood everywhere, with complete physical presence, fully occupying the space he was in. "I keep thinking I should say something significant," he said. "It being the day." "You don't have to." "No," he agreed. "I know." He looked out at the garden. The dill came in. It did. Margaret would have been... He stopped. He let the sentence sit incomplete for a moment, then tried again. "She would have liked you." Eliza looked at the garden. She had thought about Margaret Crow many times over the past 8 months, not with guilt or competition, but with the specific respect owed to a woman who had built something real here and left it behind for others to continue. She had tried to be worthy of the boys that woman had raised. She hoped she had, mostly. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. He nodded. They stood at the window together until Samuel came downstairs at a volume that permanently ended any atmosphere of quiet contemplation, announcing that he was hungry and also had decided he wanted to wear his good shirt to the wedding but couldn't find it, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do. The ceremony was held in the yard, which was the right place for it. This was a ranch, not a parlor. The meaning of the day was not separate from the land it happened on, but woven into it. The fences visible from where they stood, the cattle grazing in the north pasture, the barn Eliza had worked in through the hard months of winter, the kitchen garden and its east corner of dill. Thaddeus stood in the yard he had broken with his own hands 19 years ago and married a woman who had ridden out to check his gate latch because she'd noticed it was loose. And it was the most honest ceremony either of them could have imagined. He said his piece without a prepared speech, because he was not a man for prepared speeches. He said it the way he'd said everything since the night in the kitchen, directly, without decoration, meaning every word. He told her, in front of the small collection of people who had watched this happen, that he had failed at most of the things that required a person to be open, for a long time, and that she had not fixed that by being easy or by being patient in the soft way people talked about patience. She'd been patient the way good land is patient. Still there, still worth working, regardless of the season. He said he intended to be worth the effort. He said it like a promise rather than a sentiment, which was the only way he knew how to say things. She told him, when it was her turn, that she had arrived here with a cracked satchel and no guarantee, and had found, entirely without planning for it, the thing she hadn't been looking for. She said she didn't believe in perfect things because she'd lived long enough to know that perfect was what people called something from far enough away that they couldn't see its complications. What she believed in was real things, things that had been tested and held, things that showed their repairs. This ranch, these boys, this man, all of them real, all of them hers, if he was willing. He was willing. The minister said his short, practical piece, and it was done. Dorothy Marsh cried, which surprised nobody. Hal Briggs did not cry, but he blew his nose with great vigor at a moment that had nothing to do with dust. Cooper's wife reached for Cooper's hand. Samuel, standing next to his brother in his recovered good shirt, watched the whole thing with the solemn joy of a child who has understood that something permanent has just happened and is appropriately impressed by it. Nolan didn't cry either. He was 12. And 12-year-old boys who have been through what he'd been through developed a relationship with crying that involved doing it privately and denying it publicly. But afterward, when the small celebration had moved to the yard with food and the low, warm noise of people gathered for a good reason, he found Eliza standing near the fence at the edge of the gathering, a moment of quiet she'd apparently needed, and he came and stood beside her the way his father stood beside people, not demanding anything, just being there. They stood like that for a while. "I told Samuel," Nolan said eventually, "that I knew this was going to happen." She looked at him sideways. "Did you?" "The day Dad bought the 4th chair," he said, "for the kitchen table. He didn't say anything about it, just brought it in and put it at the table like it had always been there. I was about 9 the day he did it." He looked out at the land. "I don't think he even knew why he did it." She thought about that chair. The one that had simply appeared one evening made space at a table that had held 3 for 4 years. She'd sat in it every day without thinking about it particularly. "You were 9, she said. "You couldn't have known what it meant." "I didn't know what it meant," he said. "I just knew it meant something." He paused. "He doesn't do things without a reason. He just doesn't always know the reason yet." She looked at this 12-year-old boy, the one who had stood in the kitchen doorway 8 months ago with the coldest, flattest look she'd ever received from a child, calculating how long before she'd leave. The one who had told her about Dill in the dark and his mother's failed herb garden, and had asked her in a barn whether she'd stayed for reasons beyond necessity. "Nolan," she said. "Thank you." He looked uncomfortable, the way 12-year-old boys look when they've received a sincere thank you. They're not sure how to hold. "For what?" "For the supper table," she said. "The question you asked." He glanced away, the ghost of something that might eventually become a smirk crossing his face. Someone had to say it. "I know. He was going to keep—" He made a gesture with one hand that managed to convey the entire architecture of his father's interior management system in a single motion. "I know," she said again. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. "You're good for him," he said. "I'm not going to keep saying it, but I wanted to say it once, properly." She felt something in her chest that she didn't try to name. "You're good for me too," she said. "Both of you." He accepted this with the nod, and a slight reddening of his ears that he covered by turning to watch the gathering, where Samuel was currently involved in an elaborate story involving his good shirt and the escaped chickens that morning, and the way those two events were connected, performing it for Hal Briggs with a detail and drama that suggested it would last another 10 minutes at minimum. He's going to talk about those chickens for the rest of his life, Nolan said. Probably, she agreed. And Nolan smiled. A real one, full and unguarded. The smile of a boy who had decided it was safe to be happy. She saw it in profile, and she thought, there it is. There's the boy under all that careful watching. The summer moved the way summers do when a person is finally, actually present in them rather than enduring them. The ranch work was harder with the Henderson land added in, but it was the heart of building rather than the heart of surviving. And there's a difference between those two kinds of work that anyone who's experienced both will tell you changes everything about how the days feel. Thaddeus bought 2 more head to run on the new pasture. He brought Cooper on full-time, which required some negotiation but was arrived at on fair terms, because Thaddeus had never been the kind of man who cheated people who worked for him. The ranch began to grow in the way that things grow when they have enough of what they need. Not fast or dramatic, but steadily, season by season, accumulating towards something that would outlast the current generation if they were careful with it. Eliza ran the household with the same practical authority she'd brought to it from the first week. Expanded now to include the Henderson cabin, which needed winterizing, the expanded kitchen garden, and the ongoing project of a working relationship with Dorothy Marsh, who had appointed herself something between a mentor and an audience to Eliza's life in Black Hollow, and showed up regularly with opinions and preserves in roughly equal measure. Eliza received both with the equanimity she brought to most things, and Dorothy declared her, in the way Dorothy declared things, a woman of uncommon sense, and they would be friends for 40 years. The house changed in ways that were physical and ways that weren't. The physical ones were visible. The kitchen table that had held 3 chairs for 4 years, and then 4, and would eventually need to be larger. The garden that expanded past the original beds as Eliza's ambition for it grew alongside the growing season. Small repairs, accumulated improvements, the general evidence of a house being actively maintained by people who intended to stay in it. The other ways were harder to see, but more important. Nolan turned 13 in October, and then 14, and then 15, and with each year shed some of the watchful wariness that had been both his armor and his limitation, replacing it with something more open without losing the quality of attention that had always been his particular gift. He had his father's ability to read land and weather, and he had something else too. A patience with people, a capacity for understanding what someone was carrying without being told, that had been shaped by 2 years of watching Eliza operate in the world and absorbing, without knowing it, her particular approach to other human beings. He was going to be, Thaddeus said once to Eliza at the end of an evening, a remarkable man. She said she knew. She'd been able to see it since the kitchen doorway in October, past the cold, flat look, into the boy underneath it who was paying very careful attention to everything. Samuel turned 9 and 10 and continued to be comprehensively, exhaustingly himself, which was a considerable self, full of stories and drawings and opinions, and a warmth that he extended without calculation to virtually every person and most animals he encountered. His horse drawings improved. He had taken to writing the stories down, filling notebooks with them with the total commitment of a person who has found the thing they're supposed to do, and Eliza sat with him in the evenings when she could and read what he'd written and gave him the same direct, genuine feedback she gave everything. Not soft, not harsh, but honest. He was good. He was going to be better. She told him so, and he believed her, which was the beginning of the kind of confidence that doesn't collapse under pressure. There was a night in the second winter of their marriage, not a crisis, just an ordinary Tuesday in February, when Thaddeus came in from the barn late to find the house already quiet, the boys asleep, Eliza at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her small notebook, writing something. She closed it when she heard him, the same way she had the very first morning he'd come downstairs before dawn and found her there. He hung up his coat. He noticed that she'd closed the notebook and was struck suddenly by the memory of the first morning. The same gesture, the same quality of privacy around whatever she wrote in it. 8 months of careful professional distance and then 8 months of marriage, and he still didn't know what was in the notebook. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was comfortable, direct and quiet and present, in a way that some people never managed in a lifetime. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. It was late for questions. "All right." "The notebook." He gestured at it. "You've had it since you arrived. You close it when someone comes in. You've closed it every time for over a year. She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite embarrassment, but in the territory of both. It's nothing important, she said. Then you wouldn't mind telling me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I write down things I want to remember, the good ones. She turned the cover over in her hands. When I came here, I didn't have much reason to keep track of good things. So I started writing them down when they happened, so I couldn't… She stopped. So you couldn't what? He asked quietly. So I couldn't convince myself later that they didn't happen. She looked at the notebook. When you've gone long enough without much good in your days, you can start doubting your own memory of the times there was some. I didn't want to do that. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about everything in that notebook, months of things she'd noticed and written down so she could believe in them. He wondered when the Crow Ranch had started appearing in it, and what form those entries took, and whether she'd thought when she wrote the first one that she'd still be here to write the most recent one. Is it full? He said. She opened it briefly and showed him. The pages went most of the way through. Getting there. I'll get you another one, he said. Next time I'm in town. She looked at him across the table. Something in her face that he had learned over a year of paying close attention to it, to recognize as the expression she wore when something had reached her more deeply than she intended to show. All right, she said. He got her another one. He got her another one after that too eventually, and then another, and the notebooks accumulated on the shelf in their bedroom over the years in a row that was its own kind of record. A woman who had arrived with nowhere to go and had found, against reasonable expectation, more good things than the notebooks could hold. The fourth chair and the kitchen table became, in time, a family story. It was Nolan who told it first, years later, when he was grown and had his own property 2 miles east, the Henderson land which Thaddeus had given him when he turned 22, and would come to supper on Sundays with his wife Clara, a direct, capable woman from the far side of the valley who reminded the entire Crow family of someone without anyone saying explicitly who. He told it the way you tell a story you've been carrying for a long time, accurately, without embellishment, because the true version was already as good as it needed to be. He told it about the chair his father had bought and placed at the table without explanation, sometime in the winter of 1883, before anyone had admitted to anything. How it had simply appeared, an additional chair at a table that had held 3, without announcement or justification. How 9-year-old Nolan had noticed it and understood that it meant something without knowing what. How the adults in the house had gone on having their complicated, careful, unspoken feelings for months more while the chair sat there, waiting for someone to acknowledge what it already knew. That chair, Nolan said, at a Sunday supper table that now needed 2 additional leaves to seat everyone present, was the most honest thing either of them did for the first 6 months. Thaddeus, at the head of the table that had grown far beyond the original, looked at his son with an expression that would have been offense if it hadn't been so fundamentally, helplessly true. I didn't know why I bought it, he said. I know you didn't, Nolan said. That was the point. Eliza, at the other end of the table, looked at her husband across the length of it, across the food and the children, the grandchildren who were beginning to appear, the noise and the mess, and the total evidence of a life that had expanded far beyond what either of them had been able to imagine in a kitchen in October of 1883. She looked at him, and she thought about a woman who had arrived with a cracked satchel and nothing much to lose, and had still, somehow, managed to be terrified of hoping for too much. She thought about what it had taken to stay, not just the physical staying, the work and the hard winters and the daily management of a difficult life, but the interior staying, the choice made over and over again to remain open to what was happening here rather than protect herself from it. She had made that choice imperfectly. She had retreated into practicality when things got close. She had managed her own feelings with the same systematic approach she brought to larder organization. She had been afraid more times than she'd shown and hoped more times than she'd admitted, and had been wrong about a number of things she'd been certain of. She had stayed anyway. And Thaddeus, across the table, caught her eye, and something passed between them. Not romantic in the way stories told it, not the look of people performing their happiness for an audience, but the look of 2 people who had been genuinely, completely honest with each other about what they were and what they couldn't be and had chosen to be here anyway. The look of people who knew each other's specific weight and had decided it was worth carrying. He'd never been a man for speeches or gestures. But he held her gaze for a moment longer than the noise of the table required, and it said everything the notebook couldn't hold. The ranch grew. The table grew. The dill came back every year in the east corner of the garden where Eliza had put it, because dill, given the right ground, returns to itself without being asked. The chair that had started it all was eventually retired when the table expanded, replaced by benches that could seat more, but nobody threw it out. It sat in the corner of the kitchen for years, accumulating the general purpose of such things. A place to set something temporarily, a surface for folded laundry on its way to somewhere else, occasionally a seat for a grandchild who had been told to sit and think about something. It was an ordinary chair, scarred and plain, with no particular beauty or craftsmanship to recommend it. But Nolan's children grew up knowing the story of it, and their children knew it too. The way a quiet man had walked into a store sometime in the late winter of 1883 and bought one additional chair without being able to explain why, and brought it home and placed it at a table where there was, at that point, no one obvious to sit in it. The way that chair had been the first honest thing, the first admission, made without words and maybe without awareness, that there was a space in this family that was meant to be filled. Not because someone had decided it, not because a contract required it, because some part of him, under all the walls and the management and the 4 years of efficient survival, had already understood what he hadn't yet said out loud, that the person who would sit in that chair was going to matter more than anything he had built, more than the land or the livestock or the fences that held through every winter, that the work of a life was not in what you accumulated but in who you chose to come home to. He just needed the rest of himself to catch up. He did, eventually. They all do, if the person who sits in the chair is patient enough to wait and brave enough to stay.